Chapter 15 of Company Aytch by Sam R. Watkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Advance into Tennessee. General Hood makes a flank movement. After remaining a good long time at Jonesboro, the news came that we were going to flank Atlanta. We flanked it. A flank means a go-around. Yank says, "What are you doing, Johnny?" Johnny says, "We are flanking." Yank says, "Bully for you." We passed around Atlanta, crossed the Chattahoochee, and traveled back over the same route on which we had made the arduous campaign under Joe Johnson. It took us 4 months in the first instance, and but little longer than as many days in the second to get back to Dalton, our starting point. On our way up there, the Yankee cavalry followed us to see how we were getting along with the flanking business. We had pontoons made for the purpose of crossing streams. When we would get to a stream, the pontoons would be thrown across, and Hood's army would cross. Yank would halloo over and say, "Well, Johnny, have you got everything across?" "Yes," would be the answer. "Well, we want those old pontoons, as you will not need them again," and they would take them. We passed all those glorious battlefields that have been made classic in history, frequently coming across the skull of some poor fellow sitting on top of a stump grinning a ghastly smile, also the bones of horses along the road, and fences burned and destroyed, and occasionally the charred remains of a once fine dwelling-house. Outside of these occasional reminders, we could see no evidence of the desolation of the track of an invading army. The country looked like it did at first. Citizens came out and seemed glad to see us, and would divide their onions, garlic, and leek with us. The soldiers were in good spirits, but it was the spirit of innocence and peace, not war and victory. Where the railroads would cross a river, a blockhouse had been erected, and the bridge was guarded by a company of Federals. But we always flanked these little affairs. We wanted bigger and better meat. We capture Dalton. When we arrived at Dalton, we had a desire to see how the old place looked. Not that we cared anything about it, but we just wanted to take a last farewell look at the old place. We saw the United States flag flying from the ramparts, and thought that Yank would probably be asleep or catching lice, or maybe engaged in a game of 7-Up. So we sent forward a physician with some white bandages tied to the end of a long pole. He walked up and says, "Hello, boys." "What is it, boss?" "Well, boys, we've come for you." "Hi-ya, hi-ya, hi-ya, he, if it ain't old master, show." The place was guarded by Negro troops. We marched the black rascals out. They were mighty glad to see us, and we were kindly disposed to them. We said, "Now, boys, we don't want the Yankees to get mad at you and to blame you, so let's just get out here on the railroad track and tear it up and pile up the cross ties and then pile the iron on top of them, and we'll set the thing afire, and when the Yankees come back they will say, 'What a bully fight them naggers did make.'" A Yankee always says nagger. Reader, you should have seen how that old railroad did flop over, and how the darkies did sweat, and how the perfume did fill the atmosphere. But there were some Yankee soldiers in a blockhouse at Ringgold Gap who thought they would act big. They said that Sherman had told them not to come out of that blockhouse anyhow. But General William B. Bate began to persuade the gentlemen by sending a few 4-pound parrot feelers. Ah, those feelers! They persuaded eloquently. They persuaded effectually, those feelers did. The Yankees soon surrendered. The old place looked natural-like, only it seemed to have a sort of graveyard loneliness about it. A Man in the Well. On leaving Dalton after a day's march, we had stopped for the night. Our guns were stacked, and I started off with a comrade to get some wood to cook supper with. We were walking along, he a little in the rear, when he suddenly disappeared. I could not imagine what had become of him. I looked everywhere. The earth seemed to have opened and swallowed him. I called and called, but could get no answer. Presently I heard a groan that seemed to come out of the bowels of the earth, but as yet I could not make out where he was. Going back to camp, I procured a light, and after whooping and hallooing for a long time, I heard another groan, this time much louder than before. The voice appeared to be overhead. There was no tree or house to be seen, and then again the voice seemed to answer from under the ground in a hollow, sepulchral tone. But I could not tell where he was. But I was determined to find him, so I kept on hallooing and he answering. I went to the place where the voice appeared to come out of the earth. I was walking along rather thoughtlessly and carelessly, when 1 inch more, and I would have disappeared also. Right before me I saw the long, dry grass all bending toward a common center, and I knew that it was an old well, and that my comrade had fallen in it. But how to get him out was the unsolved problem. I ran back to camp to get assistance, and everybody had a great curiosity to see the man in the well. They would get chunks of fire and shake over the well, and peeping down would say, "Well, he's in there," and go off, and others would come and talk about his being in there. The poor fellow stayed in that well all night. The next morning we got a long rope from a battery and let it down in the well, and soon had him on terra firma. He was worse scared than hurt. Tuscumbia. We arrived and remained at Tuscumbia several days, awaiting the laying of the pontoons across the Tennessee River at Florence, Alabama, and then we all crossed over. While at Tuscumbia, John Branch and I saw a nice sweet potato patch that looked very tempting to a hungry rebel. We looked all around and thought that the coast was clear. We jumped over the fence and commenced grabbing for the sweet potatoes. I had got my haversack full and had started off when we heard, "Halt there!" I looked around, and there was a soldier guard. We broke and run like quarter horses, and the guard pulled down on us just as we jumped the fence. I don't think his gun was loaded, though, because we did not hear the ball whistle. We marched from Decatur to Florence. Here the pontoon bridges were nicely and beautifully stretched across the river. We walked over this floating bridge, and soon found ourselves on the Tennessee side of Tennessee River. In driving a great herd of cattle across the pontoon, the front one got stubborn, and the others, crowding up all in one bulk, broke the line that held the pontoon and drowned many of the drove. We had beef for supper that night. En route for Columbia. And nightly we pitch our moving tent, a day's march nearer home. How every pulse did beat and leap, and how every heart did throb with emotions of joy, which seemed nearly akin to heaven when we received the glad intelligence of our onward march toward the land of promise and of our loved ones. The cold November winds coming off the mountains of the northwest were blowing right in our faces and nearly cutting us in two. We were inured to privations and hardships, had been upon every march, in every battle, in every skirmish, in every advance, in every retreat, in every victory, in every defeat. We had laid under the burning heat of a tropical sun, had made the cold, frozen earth our bed, with no covering save the blue canopy of heaven, had braved dangers, had breasted floods, had seen our comrades slain upon our right and our left hand, had heard guns that carried death in their missiles, had heard the shouts of the charge, had seen the enemy in full retreat and flying in every direction, had heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded and dying, had seen the blood of our countrymen dyeing the earth and enriching the soil, had been hungry when there was nothing to eat, had been in rags and tatters. We had marked the frozen earth with bloody and unshod feet. We had been elated with victory and crushed by defeat, had seen and felt the pleasure of the life of a soldier, and had drank the cup to its dregs. Yes, we had seen it all, and had shared in its hopes and its fears, its love and its hate, its good and its bad, its virtue and its vice, its glories and its shame. We had followed the successes and reverses of the flag of the lost cause through all these years of blood and strife. I was simply one of hundreds of thousands in the same fix. The tale is the same that every soldier would tell, except Jim Whitler. Jim had dodged about, and had escaped being conscripted until Hood's raid, he called it. Hood's army was taking up every able-bodied man and conscripting him into the army. Jim Whitler had got a position as overseer on a large plantation and had about 100 Negroes under his surveillance. The army had been passing a given point, and Jim was sitting quietly on the fence looking at the soldiers. The conscripting squad nabbed him. Jim tried to beg off, but all entreaty was in vain. He wanted to go by home and tell his wife and children good-bye and to get his clothes. It was no go. But after a while, Jim says, "Gentlemen, ganny, the law." You see, Jim knowed the law. He didn't know B from a bull's foot in the spelling book, but he said, "the law." Now, when anyone says anything about the law, everyone stops to listen. Jim says, ganny, the law," laying great stress upon the law, "allows every man who has 20 Negroes to stay at home. Ganny." Those old soldiers had long, long ago forgotten about that old law of the long-gone past. But Jim had treasured it up in his memory, these many years, and he thought it would serve him now, as it had no doubt frequently done in the past. The conscript officer said, "Law or no law, you fall into line, take this gun and cartridge box, and march." Jim's spirits sank. His hopes vanished into air. Jim was soon in line and was tramping to the music of the march. He stayed with the company 2 days. The third day it was reported that the Yankees had taken position on the Murfreesboro pike. A regiment was sent to the attack. It was Jim's regiment. He advanced bravely into battle. The Minnie-balls began to whistle around his ears. The regiment was ordered to fire. He hadn't seen anything to shoot at, but he blazed away. He loaded and fired the second time, when they were ordered to retreat. He didn't see anything to run from, but the other soldiers began to run, and Jim run too. Jim had not learned the word halt, and just kept on running. He run, and he run, and he run, and kept on running until he got home, when he jumped in his door and shouted, "Whoopee Rhoda, ganny, I've served 4 years in the rebel army." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Company Aytch by Sam R. Watkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Battles in Tennessee. Columbia. This is my own, my native land. Once more the Murray Greys are permitted to put their feet upon their native heath, and to revisit their homes and friends after having followed their tattered and torn and battle-riddled flag, which they had borne aloft for 4 long years on every march and in every battle that had been fought by the Army of Tennessee. We were a mere handful of devoted braves who had stood by our colors when sometimes it seemed that God himself had forsaken us. But parents, here are your noble and brave sons. And ladies, 4 years ago you gave us this flag, and we promised you that we would come back with the flag as victors, or we would come not at all. We have been true to our promise and our trust. On every battlefield, the flag that you entrusted to our hands has been borne aloft by brave and heroic men amid shot and shell, bloody battle and death. We have never forsaken our colors. Are we worthy to be called the sons of old Murray County? Or have we fought in vain? Have our efforts been appreciated? Or have 4 years of our lives been wasted while we were battling for constitutional government, the supremacy of our laws over centralization, and our rights as guaranteed to us by the blood of our forefathers on the battlefields of the Revolution? It is for you to make up your verdict. If our lives as soldiers have been a failure, we can but bow our heads on our bosoms and say, surely 4 years of our lives have been given for naught, and our efforts to please you have been in vain. Yet the invader's foot is still on our soil, but there beats in our bosoms the blood of brave and patriotic men, and we will continue to follow our old and war-worn and battle-riddled flag until it goes down forever. The Murray Greys, commanded by Captain A.M. Looney, left Columbia 4 years ago with 120 men. How many of those 120 original members are with the company today? Just 12. Company Aytch has 20 members, but some of this number had subsequently enlisted. But we 12 will stick to our colors until she goes down forever, and until 5 more of this number fall dead and bleeding on the battlefield. A fiasco. When we arrived on the site of Columbia, we found the Yankees still in possession of the town, fortified and determined to resist our advance. We sent forward a feeler, and the feeler reports back very promptly. Yes, the Yankees are there. Well, if that be the case, we'll just make a flank movement. We turn off the main turnpike at J.E.R. Carpenter's and march through the cedars and cross Duck River at Davis's Ferry on pontoon bridges near Lowell's Mill. We pass on and cross Rutherford Creek near Burrick's Mill about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We had marched through fields in the heavy mud, and the men, weary and worn out, were just dragging themselves along, passing by the old Union Seminary and then by Mr. Fred Thompson's until we came to the Raleigh Hill Turnpike, it being then nearly dark. We heard some skirmishing, but exhausted as we were, we went into bivouac. The Yankees, it seems to me, might have captured the hold of us, but that is a matter of history. But I desire to state that no blunder was made by either Generals Cheatham or Stewart, neither of whom ever failed to come to time. Jeff Davis is alone responsible for the blunder. About 2 hours after sunup the next morning, we received the order to fall in, quick, make haste, hurrah, promptly, men, each rank, count 2, by the right flank, quick time, march, keep promptly closed up. Everything indicated an immediate attack. When we got to the turnpike near Spring Hill, lo and behold, wonder of wonders, the whole Yankee army had passed during the night. The bird had flown. We made a quick and rapid march down the turnpike, finding Yankee guns and knapsacks, and now and then a broken-down straggler, also 2 pieces of howitzer cannon and at least 20 broken wagons along the road. Everything betokened a rout and a stampede of the Yankee army. Double quick! Forrest is in the rear. Now for fun. All that we want to do now is to catch the blue-coated rascals, ha-ha! We all want to see the surrender, ha-ha! Double quick! A rip, rip, rip! Woof! Pant, pant, pant! First one man drops out, and then another. The Yankees are routed and running, and Forrest has crossed Harpeth River in the rear of Franklin. Hurrah, men! Keep closed up! We are going to capture Schofield. Forrest is in the rear. Never mind the straggler and cannon. Kerflop! We come up against the breastworks at Franklin. Franklin. The death angel gathers its last harvest. Kind reader, right here my pen and courage and ability fail me. I shrink from butchery. Would to God I could tear the page from these memoirs and from my own memory. It is the blackest page in the history of the War of the Lost Cause. It was the bloodiest battle of modern times in any war. It was the finishing stroke to the independence of the Southern Confederacy. I was there. I saw it. My flesh trembles and creeps and crawls when I think of it today. My heart almost ceases to beat at the horrid recollection. Would to God that I had never witnessed such a scene. I cannot describe it. It beggars description. I will not attempt to describe it. I could not. The death angel was there to gather its last harvest. It was the grand coronation of death. Would that I could turn the page. But I feel though I did so, that page would still be there, teeming with its scenes of horror and blood. I can only tell of what I saw. Our regiment was resting in the gap of a range of hills in plain view of the city of Franklin. We could see the battle flags of the enemy waving in the breeze. Our army had been depleted of its strength by a forced march from Spring Hill, and stragglers lined the road. Our artillery had not yet come up and could not be brought into action. Our cavalry was across Harpeth River, and our army was but in poor condition to make an assault. While resting on this hillside, I saw a courier dash up to our commanding general, B.F. Cheatham, and the word "Attention" was given. I knew then that we would soon be in action. Forward, march! We passed over the hill and through a little skirt of woods. The enemy were fortified right across the Franklin Pike in the suburbs of the town. Right here in these woods a detail of skirmishers was called for. Our regiment was detailed. We deployed as skirmishers, firing as we advanced on the left of the turnpike road. If I had not been a skirmisher on that day, I would not have been writing this today in the year of our Lord 1882. It was 4 o'clock on that dark and dismal December day when the line of battle was formed, and those devoted heroes were ordered forward to strike for their altars and their fires, for the green graves of their sires, for God and their native land. As they marched on down through an open field toward the rampart of blood and death, the Federal batteries began to open and mow down and gather into the garner of death as brave and good and pure spirits as the world ever saw. The twilight of evening had begun to gather as a precursor of the coming blackness of midnight darkness that was to envelop a scene so sickening and horrible that it is impossible for me to describe it. "Forward, men!" is repeated all along the line. A sheet of fire was poured into our very faces, and for a moment we halted as if in despair, as the terrible avalanche of shot and shell laid low those brave and gallant heroes whose bleeding wounds attested that the struggle would be desperate. "Forward, men!" The air loaded with death-dealing missiles. Never on this earth did men fight against such terrible odds. It seemed that the very elements of heaven and earth were in one mighty uproar. "Forward, men!" And the blood spurts in a perfect jet from the dead and wounded. The earth is red with blood. It runs in streams, making little rivulets as it flows. Occasionally there was a little lull in the storm of battle, as the men were loading their guns, and for a few moments it seemed as if night tried to cover the scene with her mantle. The death angel shrieks and laughs, and old Father Time is busy with his sickle as he gathers in the last harvest of death, crying, "More, more, more," while his rapacious maw is glutted with the slain. But the skirmish line being deployed out, extending a little wider than the battle did, passing through a thicket of small locusts, where Brown, orderly sergeant of Company B, was killed, we advanced on toward the breastworks, on and on. I had made up my mind to die. Felt glorious. We pressed forward until I heard the terrific roar of battle open on our right. Cleburne's division was charging their works. I passed on until I got to their works and got over on their, the Yankees' side, but in 50 yards of where I was, the scene was lit up by fires that seemed like hell itself. It appeared to be but one line of streaming fire. Our troops were upon one side of the breastworks and the Federals on the other. I ran up on the line of works where our men were engaged. Dead soldiers filled the entrenchments. The firing was kept up until after midnight, and gradually died out. We passed the night where we were. But when the morrow's sun began to light up the eastern sky with its rosy hues, and we looked over the battlefield, oh my God, what did we see? It was a grand holocaust of death. Death had held high carnival there that night. The dead were piled the one on the other all over the ground. I never was so horrified and appalled in all my life. Horses like men had died game on the gory breastworks. General Adams' horse had his 4 feet on one side of the works and his hind feet on the other, dead. The general seems to have been caught so that he was held to the horse's back, sitting almost as if living, riddled and mangled and torn with balls. General Cleburne's mare had her 4 feet on top of the works, dead in that position. General Cleburne's body was pierced with 49 bullets, through and through. General Strahl's horse lay by the roadside, and the general by his side, both dead, and all his staff. General Gist, a noble and brave cavalier from South Carolina, was lying with his sword reaching across the breastwork, still grasped in his hand. He was lying there dead, all dead. They sleep in the graveyard yonder at Ashwood, almost in sight of my home, where I am writing today. They sleep the sleep of the brave. We love and cherish their memory. They sleep beneath the ivy-mantled walls of St. John's Church, where they expressed a wish to be buried. The private soldier sleeps where he fell, piled in one mighty heap. 4,500 privates, all lying side by side in death. 13 generals were killed and wounded. 4,500 men slain, all piled and heaped together at one place. I cannot tell the number of others killed and wounded. God alone knows that. We'll all find out on the morning of the final resurrection. Kind friends, I have attempted in my poor and feeble way to tell you of this. I can hardly call it battle. It should be called by some other name. But like all other battles, it, too, has gone into history. I leave it with you. I do not know who was to blame. It lives in the memory of the poor old rebel soldier who went through that trying and terrible ordeal. We shed a tear for the dead. They are buried and forgotten. We meet no more on earth. But up yonder, beyond the sunset and the night, away beyond the clouds and tempest, away beyond the stars that ever twinkle and shine in the blue vault above us, away yonder by the great white throne and by the river of life, where the almighty and eternal God sits, surrounded by the angels and archangels and the redeemed of earth, we will meet again and see those noble and brave spirits who gave up their lives for their country's cause that night at Franklin, Tennessee. A life given for one's country is never lost. It blooms again beyond the grave in a land of beauty and of love. Hanging around the throne of sapphire and gold, a rich garland awaits the coming of him who died for his country. And when the horologe of time has struck its last note upon his dying brow, justice hands the record of life to mercy, and mercy pleads with Jesus, and God, for his sake, receives him in his eternal home beyond the skies at last and forever. Nashville. A few more scenes, my dear friends, and we close these memoirs. We marched toward the city of Nashville. We camped the first night at Brentwood. The next day we can see the fine old buildings of solid granite looming up on Capitol Hill, the capital of Tennessee. We can see the stars and stripes flying from the dome. Our pulse leaps with pride when we see the grand old architecture. We can hear the bugle call and the playing of the bands of the different regiments in the Federal lines. Now and then a shell is thrown into our midst from Fort Negley, but no attack or demonstrations on either side. We bivouac on the cold and hard frozen ground, and when we walk about, the echo of our footsteps sound like the echo of a tombstone. The earth is crusted with snow, and the wind from the northwest is piercing our very bones. We can see our ragged soldiers with sunken cheeks and famine-glistening eyes. Where were our generals? Alas, there were none. Not one single general out of Cheatham's division was left, not one. General B.F. Cheatham himself was the only surviving general of his old division. Nearly all our captains and colonels were gone. Companies mingled with companies, regiments with regiments, and brigades with brigades. A few raw-boned horses stood shivering under the ice-covered trees, nibbling the short, scanty grass. Being in range of the Federal guns from Fort Negley, we were not allowed to have fires at night, and our thin and ragged blankets were but poor protection against the cold, raw blasts of December weather, the coldest ever known. The cold stars seem to twinkle with unusual brilliancy, and the pale moon seems to be but one vast heap of frozen snow, which glimmers in the cold gray sky, and the air gets colder by its coming. Our breath, forming in little rays, seems to make 1,000 little coruscations that scintillate in the cold, frosty air. I can tell you nothing of what was going on among the generals, but there we were, and that is all that I can tell you. One morning, about daylight, our army began to move. Our division was then on the extreme right wing, and then we were transferred to the left wing. The battle had begun. We were continually moving to our left. We would build little temporary breastworks, then we would be moved to another place. Our lines kept on widening out and stretching further and further apart until it was not more than a skeleton of a skirmish line from one end to the other. We started at a run. We cared for nothing. Not more than 1,000 yards off we could see the Yankee cavalry, artillery, and infantry marching apparently still further to our left. We could see regiments advancing at double quick across the fields, while with our army everything seemed confused. The private soldier could not see into things. It seemed to be somewhat like a flock of wild geese where they've lost their leader. We were willing to go anywhere or to follow anyone who would lead us. We were anxious to flee, fight, or fortify. I have never seen an army so confused and demoralized. The whole thing seemed to be tottering and trembling when, halt, front, right dress, and Adjutant McKinley reads us the following order. Soldiers, the commanding general takes pleasure in announcing to his troops that victory and success are now within their grasp. and the commanding general feels proud and gratified that in every attack and assault the enemy have been repulsed, and the commanding general will further say to his noble and gallant troops, "Be of good cheer, all is well." General John B. Hood, General Commanding. Kinloch Falconer, Acting Adjutant General. I remember how this order was received. Every soldier said, "Oh, shucks, that is all shenanigan." For we knew that we had never met the enemy or fired a gun outside of a little skirmishing, and I will further state that that battle order announcing success and victory was the cause of a greater demoralization than if our troops had actually engaged in battle. They at once mistrusted General Hood's judgment as a commander, and every private soldier in the whole army knew the situation of affairs. I remember when passing by Hood how feeble and decrepit he looked, with an arm in a sling and a crutch in the other hand, and trying to guide and control his horse. And reader, I was not a Christian then, and I am but little better today. But as God sees my heart tonight, I prayed in my heart that day for General Hood. Poor fellow, I loved him, not as a general, but as a good man. I knew that when that army order was read, that General Hood had been deceived, and that the poor fellow was only trying to encourage his men. Every impulse of his nature was but to do good, and to serve his country as best he could. Ah, reader, some day all will be well. We continued marching toward our left, our battle line getting thinner and thinner. We could see the Federals advancing, their blue coats and banners flying, and we could see their movements and hear them giving their commands. Our regiment was ordered to double quick to the extreme left wing of the army, and we had to pass up a steep hill, and the dead grass was wet and as slick as glass, and it was with the greatest difficulty that we could get up that steep hillside. When we got to the top, we, as skirmishers, were ordered to deploy still further to the left. Billy Carr and J.E. Jones, two as brave soldiers as ever breathed the breath of life, in fact, it was given up that they were the bravest and most daring men in the Army of Tennessee, and myself, were on the very extreme left wing of our army. While we were deployed as skirmishers, I heard, "Surrender! Surrender!" and on looking around us, I saw that we were right in the midst of a Yankee line of battle. They were lying down in the bushes, and we were not looking for them so close to us. We immediately threw down our guns and surrendered. J.E. Jones was killed at the first discharge of their guns, when another Yankee raised up and took deliberate aim at Billy Carr and fired, the ball striking him below the eye and passing through his head. As soon as I could, I picked up my gun, and as the Yankee turned, I sent a Minnie ball crushing through his head, and broke and run. But I am certain that I killed the Yankee who killed Billy Carr. But it was too late to save the poor boy's life. As I started to run, a fallen dogwood tree tripped me up, and I fell over the log. It was all that saved me. The log was riddled with balls, and thousands, it seemed to me, passed over it. As I got up to run again, I was shot through the middle finger of the very hand that is now penning these lines, and the thigh. But I had just killed a Yankee, and I was determined to get away from there as soon as I could. How I did get back I hardly know, for I was wounded and surrounded by Yankees. One rushed forward, and placing the muzzle of his gun in 2 feet of me, discharged it, but it missed its aim when I ran at him, grabbing him by the collar and brought him off a prisoner. Captain Joe P. Lee and Colonel H. R. Field remember this, as would Lieutenant Colonel John L. House, were he alive, and all the balance of Company Aytch who were there at the time. I had 8 bullet holes in my coat and 2 in my hand, besides the one in my thigh and finger. It was a hailstorm of bullets. The above is true in every particular, and it is but one incident of the war, which happened to hundreds of others. But alas, all our valor and victories were in vain, when God and the whole world were against us. Billy Carr was one of the bravest and best men I ever knew. He never knew what fear was, and in consequence of his reckless bravery had been badly wounded at Perryville, Murfreesboro, Chickamauga, the Octagon House, Dead Angle, and the 22nd of July at Atlanta. In every battle he was wounded, and finally, in the very last battle of the war, surrendered up his life for his country's cause. No father and mother of such a brave and gallant boy should ever sorrow or regret having borne to them such a son. He was the flower and chivalry of his company. He was as good as he was brave. His bones rest yonder on the Overton Hills today, while I have no doubt in my own mind that his spirit is with the Redeemer of the hosts of heaven. He was my friend. Poor boy, farewell. When I got back to where I could see our lines, it was one scene of confusion and rout. Finney's Florida Brigade had broken before a mere skirmish line, and soon the whole army had caught the infection, had broken, and were running in every direction. Such a scene I never saw. The army was panic-stricken. The woods everywhere were full of running soldiers. Our officers were crying, "Halt! Halt!" and trying to rally and reform their broken ranks. The Federals would dash their cavalry in amongst us, and even their cannon joined in the charge. One piece of Yankee artillery galloped past me, right on the road, unlimbered their gun, fired a few shots, and galloped ahead again. Hood's whole army was routed and in full retreat. Nearly every man in the entire army had thrown away his gun and accoutrements. More than 10,000 had stopped and allowed themselves to be captured, while many, dreading the horrors of a northern prison, kept on. And I saw many, yea, even thousands, broken down from sheer exhaustion, with despair and pity written on their features. Wagon trains, cannon, artillery, cavalry, and infantry were all blended in inextricable confusion. Broken down and jaded horses and mules refused to pull, and the badly scared drivers looked like their eyes would pop out of their heads from fright. Wagon wheels, interlocking each other, soon clogged the road, and wagons, horses, and provisions were left indiscriminately. The officers soon became affected with the demoralization of their troops and rode on in dogged indifference. General Frank Cheatham and General Loring tried to form a line at Brentwood, but the line they formed was like trying to stop the current of Duck River with a fishnet. I believe the army would have rallied, had there been any colors to rally to, and as the straggling army moves on down the road, every now and then we can hear the sullen roar of the Federal artillery booming in the distance. I saw a wagon and team abandoned, and I unhitched one of the horses and rode on horseback to Franklin, where a surgeon tied up my broken finger and bandaged up my bleeding thigh. My boot was full of blood, and my clothing saturated with it. I was at General Hood's headquarters. He was much agitated and affected, pulling his hair with his one hand, he had but one, and crying like his heart would break. I pitied him, poor fellow. I asked him for a wounded furlough, and he gave it to me. I never saw him afterward. I always loved and honored him, and I will ever revere and cherish his memory. He gave his life in the service of his country, and I know today he wears a garland of glory beyond the grave, where justice says, "Well done," and mercy has erased all his errors and faults. I only write of the understrata of history, in other words, the private's history, as I saw things then and remember them now. The winter of 1864-5 was the coldest that had been known for many years. The ground was frozen and rough, and our soldiers were poorly clad, while many, yes, very many, were entirely barefooted. Our wagon trains had either gone on, we knew not whither, or had been left behind. Everything, and nature too, seemed to be working against us. Even the keen, cutting air that whistled through our tattered clothes and over our poorly covered heads seemed to lash us in its fury. The floods of waters that had overflowed their banks seemed to laugh at our calamity and to mock us and our misfortunes. All along the route were weary and footsore soldiers. The citizens seemed to shrink and hide from us as we approached them, and to cap the climax, Tennessee River was overflowing its banks, and several Federal gunboats were anchored just below Muscle Shoals, firing at us while crossing. The once proud Army of Tennessee had degenerated into a mob. We were pinched by hunger and cold. The rains and sleet and snow never ceased falling from the winter sky, while the winds pierced the old ragged grayback rebel soldier to his very marrow. The clothing of many were hanging about them in shreds of rags and tatters, while an old slouched hat covered their frozen ears. Some were on old raw-boned horses without saddles. Honorable Jefferson Davis perhaps made blunders and mistakes, but I honestly believe that he ever did what he thought best for the good of his country. And there never lived on this earth, from the days of Hampton to George Washington, a purer patriot or nobler man than Jefferson Davis, and like Marius, grand even in ruins. Hood was a good man, a kind man, a philanthropic man. But he is both harmless and defenseless now. He was a poor general in the capacity of commander-in-chief. Had he been mentally qualified, his physical condition would have disqualified him. His legs and one of his arms had been shot off in the defense of his country. As a soldier, he was brave, good, noble, and gallant, and fought with the ferociousness of the wounded tiger and with the everlasting grit of the bulldog. But as a general, he was a failure in every particular. Our country is gone, our cause is lost. Actum est de Republica. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Company Aytch by Sam R. Watkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Surrender. The last act of the drama. On the 10th day of May, 1861, our regiment, the 1st Tennessee, left Nashville for the camp of instruction with 1,250 men, officers, and line. Other recruits continually coming in swelled this number to 1,400. In addition to this, Major Fulker's battalion of 4 companies with 400 men originally was afterwards attached to the regiment, and the 27th Tennessee Regiment was afterwards consolidated with the 1st. And besides this, there were about 200 conscripts added to the regiment from time to time. To recapitulate, the 1st Tennessee, numbering originally 1,250, recruited from time to time 150, Fulker's battalion 400, the 27th Tennessee 1,200, number of conscripts at the lowest estimate 200, making the sum total 3,200 men that belonged to our regiment during the war. The above, I think, a low estimate. Well, on the 26th day of April, 1865, General Joe E. Johnson surrendered his army at Greensboro, North Carolina. The day that we surrendered our regiment, it was a pitiful sight to behold. If I remember correctly, there were just 65 men in all, including officers, that were paroled on that day. Now, what had become of the original 3,200? A grand army, you may say. 3,200 men. Only 65 left. Now, reader, you may draw your own conclusions. It lacked just 4 days of 4 years from the day we were sworn in to the day of the surrender, and it was just 4 years and 24 days from the time that we left home for the army to the time that we got back again. It was indeed a sad sight to look at, the old 1st Tennessee Regiment. A mere squad of noble and brave men gathered around the tattered flag that they had followed in every battle through that long war. It was so bullet-riddled and torn that it was but a few blue and red shreds that hung drooping, while it too was stacked with our guns forever. Thermopylae had one messenger of defeat, but when General Joe E. Johnson surrendered the Army of the South, there were hundreds of regiments, yea, I might safely say thousands, that had not a representative on the 26th day of April, 1865. Our cause was lost from the beginning. Our greatest victories, Chickamauga and Franklin, were our greatest defeats. Our people were divided upon the question of Union and secession. Our generals were scrambling for who ranked. The private soldier fought and starved and died for naught. Our hospitals were crowded with sick and wounded, but half provided with food and clothing to sustain life. Our money was depreciated to naught, and our cause lost. We left our homes 4 years previous. Amid the waving of flags and handkerchiefs and the smiles of the ladies, while the fife and drum were playing Dixie and the bonny blue flag, we bid farewell to home and friends. The bones of our brave Southern boys lie scattered over our loved South. They fought for their country, and they gave their lives freely for that country's cause. And now they who survive sit like Marius amid the wreck of Carthage, sublime even in ruins. Other pens, abler than mine, will have to chronicle their glorious deeds of valor and devotion. In these sketches I have named but a few persons who fought side by side with me during that long and unholy war, In looking back over these pages, I ask, where now are many whose names have appeared in these sketches? They are up yonder, and are no doubt waiting and watching for those of us who are left behind. And, my kind reader, the time is coming when we too will be called, while the archangel of death is beating the long roll of eternity, and with us it will be the last reveille. God himself will sound the assembly on yonder beautiful and happy shore, where we will again have a grand reconfederation. We shed a tear over their flower-strewn graves. We live after them. We love their memory yet. But one generation passes away, and another generation follows. We know our loved and brave soldiers. We love them yet. But when we pass away, the impartial historian will render a true verdict, and a history will then be written in justification and vindication of those brave and noble boys who gave their all in fighting the battles of their homes, their country, and their God. The United States has no North, no South, no East, no West. We are one and undivided. Adieu. My kind friends, soldiers, comrades, brothers all, the curtain is rung down, the footlights are put out, the audience is all left and gone home, the seats are vacant, and the cold walls are silent. The gaudy tinsel that appears before the footlights is exchanged for the dress of the citizen. Coming generations and historians will be the critics as to how we have acted our parts. The past is buried in oblivion. The blood-red flag, with its crescent and cross that we followed for 4 long, bloody, and disastrous years, has been folded, never again to be unfurled. We have no regrets for what we did, but we mourn the loss of so many brave and gallant men who perished on the field of battle in honor. I now bid you an affectionate adieu. But in closing these memoirs, the scenes of my life pass in rapid review before me. In imagination, I am young again tonight. I feel the flush and vigor of my manhood, am just 21 years of age. I hear the fife and drum playing Dixie and Bonnie Blue Flag. I see and hear our fire-eating stumperators tell of the right of secession and disunion. I see our fair and beautiful women waving their handkerchiefs and encouraging their sweethearts to go to the war. I see the marshalling of the hosts for glorious war. I see the fine banners waving and hear the cry everywhere, "To arms, to arms!" And I see our country at peace and prosperous, our fine cities look grand and gay, our fields rich and abundant harvests, our people happy and contented. All these pass in imagination before me. Then I look and see glorious war in all its splendor. I hear the shout and charge, the boom of artillery and the rattle of small arms. I see gaily dressed officers charging backwards and forwards upon their mettled war horses, clothed in the panoply of war. I see victory and conquest upon flying banners. I see our arms triumph in every battle. And oh, my friends, I see another scene. I see broken homes and broken hearts. I see war in all its desolation. I see a country ruined and impoverished. I see a nation disenfranchised and maltreated. I see a commonwealth forced to pay dishonest and fraudulent bonds that were issued to crush that people. I see sycophants licking the boots of their country's oppressor. I see other and many wrongs perpetrated upon a conquered people. But maybe it is but the ghosts and phantoms of a dreamy mind, or the wind as it whistles around our lonely cabin home. The past is buried in oblivion. The mantle of charity has long ago fallen upon those who think differently from us. We remember no longer wrongs and injustice done us by anyone on earth. We are willing to forget and forgive those who have wronged and falsified us. We look up above and beyond all those petty, groveling things and shake hands and forget the past. And while my imagination is like the weaver's shuttle, playing backward and forward through these 2 decades of time, I ask myself, are these things real? Did they happen? Are they being enacted today? Or are they the fancies of the imagination and forgetful reverie? Is it true that I have seen all these things? That they are real incidents in my life's history? Did I see those brave and noble countrymen of mine laid low in death and weltering in their blood? Did I see our country laid waste and in ruins? Did I see soldiers marching, the earth trembling and jarring beneath their measured tread? Did I see the ruins of smoldering cities and deserted homes? Did I see my comrades buried and see the violet and wild flowers bloom over their graves? Did I see the flag of my country that I had followed so long, furled to be no more unfurled forever? Surely they are but the vagaries of mine own imagination. Surely my fancies are running wild tonight. But hush! I now hear the approach of battle. That low, rumbling sound in the west is the roar of cannon in the distance. That rushing sound is the tread of soldiers. That quick, lurid glare is the flash that precedes the cannon's roar. And listen! That loud report that makes the earth tremble and jar and sway is but the bursting of a shell as it screams through the dark, tempestuous night. That black ebon cloud where the lurid lightning flickers and flares that is rolling through the heavens is the smoke of battle. Beneath is being enacted a carnage of blood and death. Listen! The soldiers are charging now. The flashes and roaring now are blending with the shouts of soldiers and the confusion of battle. But, reader, time has brought his changes since I, a young, ardent, and impetuous youth, burning with a lofty patriotism, first shouldered my musket to defend the rights of my country. Lifting the veil of the past, I see many manly forms, bright in youth and hope, standing in view by my side in Company Aytch, 1st Tennessee Regiment. Again I look, and half those forms are gone. Again, and gray locks and wrinkled faces and clouded brows stand before me. Before me, too, I see not in imagination, but in reality, my own loved Jenny, the partner of my joys and the sharer of my sorrows, sustaining, comforting, and cheering my pathway by her benignant smile, pouring the sunshine of domestic comfort and happiness upon our humble home, making life more worth the living as we toil on up the hill of time together, with the bright pledges of our early and constant love by our side, while the sunlight of hope ever brightens our pathway, dispelling darkness and sorrow, as we hand in hand approach the valley of the great shadow. The tale is told. The world moves on. The sun shines as brightly as before, the flowers bloom as beautifully, the birds sing their carols as sweetly, the trees nod and bow their leafy tops as if slumbering in the breeze, the gentle winds fan our brow and kiss our cheek as they pass by, the pale moon sheds her silvery sheen, the blue dome of the sky sparkles with the trembling stars that twinkle and shine and make night beautiful, and the scene melts and gradually disappears forever. End of Chapter 17. End of Company Aytch by Sam R. Watkins. Recording by Winston, Tharp.